Today I've got half an hour to talk about the need for metaphysics in psychedelic therapy and research. So this is based on a paper that just came out a few weeks ago. It's open access, so you can read it if you are so inclined. I'm going to give an overview of it now. I haven't got time for questions immediately after, but as Adrian said, I'll be happy to answer questions in the half-hour panel slot. Okay, so I've got 53 slides, so I'm going to be very fast with each one, right? But this is recorded, so you can pause it later. So 6 points. There's one primary point, and then I'm going to talk about what metaphysics is, because it's often misunderstood or misdefined, really. I'm going to talk about the relationship between metaphysics and mysticism. I'll quickly talk about what mystical experience is, or definitions thereof. And then I'm going to talk about psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences, and then lastly end with a practical conjecture about psychedelic integration with metaphysics. But the primary point, the main point of all of this, you remember just one slide, this. Psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences will be more adequately comprehended and integrated with recourse to metaphysics. It's a near tautology, almost true by definition, I would say. But the interesting fact of the matter is it doesn't really happen. So when in the clinic, at least, when if not necessarily, doesn't always happen, but if one has what I will define as metaphysical experience in a moment, the psychotherapists generally, there are some exceptions, generally don't have a training in metaphysics and so cannot fully understand the experience, in my view, and thus cannot make it fully significant to the participant. This is my proposal and conjecture. It can be tested. It's basically proposing a new aspect, a new tool, not a replacement, but a new tool for psychedelic therapy. But it also really ultimately transcends the clinic and can go into societal enrichment. But I won't focus on that. Let's start with metaphysics. So what is metaphysics? This paper, this talk really, we have this psychedelic research colloquium at Exeter, happens every 2 weeks, and we invite guest speakers in the field, and a lot of them talk about, the trials they're doing, clinical trials against, to treat depression, PTSD, OCD, so on and so forth, and they say, and then we have this integrated phase, and at the end, and I always ask, what do you do in that integrated phase? So they say, well, we talk with the person, talk about what happened to them, But it's always a bit vague. And when I looked at the research, there's no standard form of integration at all. There are 8 general models, it seems, at the moment, but that is in process. And then you look historically to psycholytic therapy in the 40s, 50s, or 50s, 60s, really. You see it's based on Freudianism and so on. So this is a emerging field that is developing. So I'm proposing the insertion, as it were, of philosophy into that, because some of the experiences are rather philosophical. What is metaphysics then? So metaphysics is not mysticism or spirituality. These are often conflated when I speak to scientists. Metaphysics have got quite a strict definition, really, at least etymologically. It comes from Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, and that book really was put together after centuries after Aristotle died, and the editor just put this collection of texts after Aristotle's works called the Physics. So meta means after in this case. There's literally after the physics on the shelf. That's where the word really comes from. And in that book, the Metaphysics, though, there are a number of subjects that kind of determine what the subject is. It has developed from Aristotle, obviously, but you get these general fields of discourse. So you have ontology, the theory of being. Some people think ontology is synonymous with metaphysics. It's a matter of definition, really. You get to talk about causation. What is a cause? Forms of space and time, the eternal, timeless, qualities, properties, relations, modalities. What is possibility? What is actuality? What is necessity? And so on. This can get very dry, and I won't bore you with the details. But it is a module here at Exeter. It's very common now in the last 30 years to teach metaphysics once again, because we've entered the so-called metaphysical turn. I say that because in the 20th century, metaphysics was a term of abuse, really, in philosophy and the general world. A.J. in the 1930s wrote an article on the impossibility of metaphysics, and it was kind of spurned, and philosophy language, logical behaviorism, logical positivism took over philosophy, psychology, and so on. But it has returned to a certain extent. Now I've created this way of looking at metaphysics, breaking it down into several components. I'm sure people will, philosophers at least, will say, no, you can't define it this way or that way. But whatever you do, no one will agree on it. So this is a general kind of a metaphysics matrix that we've created. 5 general kind of metaphysical views: physicalism and all its varieties; idealism, which seems to be becoming popular now, that the mind projects the world we perceive as a world; dualism, mind and soul are separate; monism, mind and soul are both just different expressions of the same thing, very basically speaking; and then the transcendent, they exist forms, for example, that exist outside of time and space, or God, or whatever. I realize I'm going very fast with that, but I will take questions later. And from that matrix, we've created this 40-item questionnaire, the Metaphysics Matrix Questionnaire. I created this with a colleague at Exeter here called René Joseph. This is pre-validated, but it has been validated now for you psychologists out there. This is used in my paper as a glossary for all the isms in it, but it can be used in clinical trials and theory. Here's a very basic version of metaphysics. I just create this. When I speak to non-philosophers, very generally speaking, people think either you're a physicalist, that everything consists of matter fundamentally, or you're a dualist, and that's it. But there are many other options out there that people are not aware of. I won't go through them all now, but I very gladly talk about it later, if necessary. But anyway, what I'm showing here is a menu, a metaphysical menu, as it were. That's another option. And this is one of my favorite philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead. He writes this: if you don't go into metaphysics, you assume an uncritical metaphysics. So the point really is this, that there's no neutral metaphysical point of view. People might not think about metaphysics, but you thereby absorb the metaphysics, the ideology of your culture. And it's not like Western culture is neutral, and then these strange cultures in America or the Asia sort of believe in these weird theories. We have our own metaphysics, even if you're not aware of it. Just as we have our own morality, if you're not aware of it, which can trace back historically and whatnot. Another fact of another interesting reason why I think metaphysics can be used in integration is because we don't know the relationship between mind and matter, or at least no one agrees upon the relation. I know other people will talk about this, so I won't dwell on it, but this is called the hard problem of consciousness, or the mind-matter problem. As David Chalmers coined the hard problem of consciousness. He wrote this: the hard problem, why is all this physiological processing accompanied by an experienced inner life? A solution to this problem may profoundly affect our conception of the universe and of ourselves. In other words, a solution, if there is one, to the hard problem of consciousness, if you accept it, could radically change one's metaphysical point of view. Jae-Gwon Kim, a very good philosopher of mind who died recently, he wrote this: making a running list of psychoneural correlations does not come anywhere near gaining an explanatory insight into why there are such correlations. Why are there neural correlates of consciousness, or bodily correlates of consciousness? What do they mean? It's not a sufficient explanation just to give the correlations. So the mind-matter problem, in other words, keeps the metaphysical options open for interpreting psychedelic experience. Just because you have an psychedelic experience, let's say, of pantheism, the universe is God, that might, the fact of the matter is that might be true. And you can only say it's a delusion if you know what reality is and if you know what the relation is between mind and matter. And we just don't know the answer to that. So we have to be, I say, open-minded to experiences which transcend our general cultural zeitgeist. What's the relationship then between metaphysics and mysticism? Because in most clinical trials at the moment they are issuing MEQ, HID scales, and so on. They're looking at the psychedelic experience in terms of mysticism. It's not really the same as metaphysics, even though some people say it. So metaphysics is intellectual. You study at university. There's in the last 30 years of analytic philosophy has looked at metaphysics, quite dry. You look at it in a bitty way. You look at causation, substance, relations, and so on. In the past, metaphysics was more systematic. So Kant had his great system. Hegel had his great system of philosophy, F.H. Bradley did, and so on and so forth. This is coming back now, but it's still deemed a little bit old-fashioned. I don't think it is. Spinoza had a great system, for example. There's intellectual metaphysics you study here, but there's also, I submit, experiential metaphysics. So that is not intellectual, it's not rational, it's an intuition, it's an experience. William James spoke about this, for example. He wrote, in the nitrous oxide trance, we have a genuine metaphysical revelation. Interesting, William James said he could understand Hegel by taking nitrous oxide. He really did, yeah. Mysticism, of course, mystical experience is experiential by definition. Mysticism can also be doctrinal, though, if you think about people like St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa of Avila, very Roman Catholic in that sense, interpreted in very Christian ways. But there is an overlap then between experiential metaphysics and mystical experience, an overlap, not the same thing. And then with psychedelic experience, there's this distinction, as I call it. It's not a proper word, but never mind. So psychedelic experiences don't need to be mystical. You know, if you look at, you just have a good laugh on them. You can, I'm looking at Amerindian reports of psychedelic intake. Could be to become a better hunter, or to locate a lost object, or to curse your enemy, or to heal your friend, or whatever. I mean, it's not necessarily mystical as we understand mysticism. But it can be, I submit. Metaphysics, well, you understand the relationship there. I won't dwell on it, but you'll see that we have to distinguish really metaphysics, mysticism, and psychedelic experience. There are three separate things, but there is, of course, overlap, interestingly. This overlap I'll be looking at. What is mystical experience and how does it differ from metaphysics? Well, that's a very controversial question. And by asking it and talking about mysticism, you enter into at least 4 controversies. First of all, there are very many definitions of mysticism. People do not agree on what it means. There's this really interesting debate between the perennialists and the contextualists. Very basically, perennialists like William James, Aldous Huxley, they believe that there's one core experience, peak experience, that is metacultural. All, you know, cultures may interpret it differently, but the peak experience is qualitatively identical, perhaps numerically identical. Contextualists, from the work of a guy called Stephen Katz in '78, they believe that the experience itself is conditioned by one's culture. So not just the interpretation, the actual experience. So we in the West will experience God, Jesus, and in the Americas they'd experience jaguars, snakes, and so on. It's been a massive debate in mystical sciences about this for the last half century, and now psychedelic experience and psychedelic science is adding to that debate. There's a third way, of course, which I take personally. Another controversy, whether psychedelics can induce genuine mysticism. So, for example, Zane argues that the LSD experience is not genuine mysticism. There is core perennial experience, but psychedelics won't get you there. And then whether, of course, mystical experience is radical or delusional. What the classic definitions of the last 100 years really come from William James: ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. I'm sure most of you have heard about this a million times, so I won't dwell. Evelyn Underhill has 4 other definitions. As you can see, Bertrand Russell had this amazing little essay called Mysticism and Logic from 1910, where he talks about mystical experience. He himself had a mystical experience at Whitehead's house, strangely. If you're interested, I'll tell you later about it, where he became, he transitioned from an imperialist, his Whig family, British, aristocrat, an imperialist to a pacifist. Spent time in prison for his pacifism, as you might know. And that was because of this one experience he had at Whitehead's house. Anyway, he's got his interesting definitions of mysticism there, includes the unreality of good and evil, which is not spoken about much today. But it's a very interesting topic that I shall one day return to. Now, this is the sort of very influential in science in clinical trials today. Walter Stace's book, he's got these 7 criteria for mystical states, and they inform most of the questionnaires used by people like Timmerman today. But it's quite controversial, really. The book's not great. He's got pantheism completely wrong, and I think this can be updated, this questionnaire or this criteria. people talk about mysticism as if it's a Christian thing. It's not really. I mean, Christianity played its role, but it goes back to the pagans in the West. Plotinus, the first Neoplatonist, he very much influenced our understanding of what mysticism is through St. Augustine and others. So he wrote, for example, for how can one describe as other than oneself that which, when one saw it, seemed to be one with oneself? This is no doubt why in the mysteries we are forbidden to reveal them to the uninitiated. The word mysticism, I should say, comes from the Greek word maya, which means closed. Closed lips, closed eyes. So you close your eyes to see, and you are forbidden to speak about it. The mystic was an initiate of the mysteries. The mysteries were rituals held in Greece and elsewhere, the most famous of which were the Eleusinian mysteries held annually. Well, there were two. Anyway, that's another slideshow. But anyway, our notion of mysticism really derives, interestingly, from Plotinus's Neoplatonism, and that is a monism, really. He spoke about the one, becoming part of the one. That is pagan, it's not Christian. It influenced Christianity, but it's not Christian. So, the reason I'm speaking about this is for these 2 points. Intellectual metaphysics can help explain experiential metaphysics and mystical experience. So if you only focus on mysticism, you haven't got an explanatory framework. By definition, it's mystical. You don't know what it is, right? But if you encompass that mystical experience within metaphysics, you can now make rational arguments for whatever it is you might experience. Metaphysics can therefore be of use in integrating psychedelic-induced mystical and metaphysical experiences. So let's say a person has undergone a clinical trial, psychedelic trial. They have their drug session. They think they are one with the universe. The universe has its own mind, for example. They might think then that might be noetic. That might appear to them very true during the time. And then apparently the latest empirical evidence has shown that this certain peak experience has the most therapeutic effect, because you think of yourself and your problems as relatively trivial now compared to the grander picture. So therefore, you don't need to hide your problems with alcohol or addiction or whatever, because they're not that important. This seems to be one of the key mechanisms of psychedelic therapy. But let's say you have that experience and then you return to, let's say, Devon here in England. And then after, 2 months, you're thinking, yeah, well, that was probably bullshit, wasn't it, really? I can't, there's no reason to believe that. But this is where the metaphysician comes in, you see. There are very good arguments for pantheism. Very good. From Spinoza. Pantheism was named for Spinoza's philosophy. And onwards to Whitehead and so on. We shouldn't entirely dismiss it. If we are aware that we are living within an metaphysical ideology, and if you present that to the participant, and you say, you shouldn't immediately dismiss this experience as delusional or false. The conjecture, can be tested, is that the experience will have longer-term benefits to that patient. That's a conjecture. I don't know if this is true or not, but I propose it might be true. So let's look at, what do I mean when I'm talking about psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences? What am I talking about? How much time do I have, Adrian? You have 8 minutes. Geez, right, okay, let's go fast. Right, so panpsychism. I did my PhD in panpsychism. This is from Richard Ward, 1957, a great book not many people have heard of. It's about his experience with LSD. 100 micrograms of LSD, he realized that the whole universe is made up of things which have their own natures, relationships, significances, and that on some universal scale, each thing has its own proper degree of awareness. That was an experience. He didn't come to that through reasoned argument. If you wanted reasoned argument for that, you can look at Galen Strawson or someone like that, Fechner, Spinoza, Whitehead, whatever. But that was a metaphysical experience. So you have that experience and you don't know anything about panpsychism. You've never heard of the term even. You go out of it and you think, wow, the whole world's more significant. Everything's alive, Plants have a form of sentience, But then you can't explain it, or you can't give it any form of rational significance. I think you're more likely to dismiss it. So I'm suggesting that in metaphysical integration, you don't prime people, of course. It's open, it's neutral, but you say, okay, let's at least make you realize that there's a great legacy of thought on this, and it might be true. It might be true. You should not dismiss it immediately. Nature connectedness. I won't go through all of these. It's an interesting one where he became one with the daffodil. Alan Watts' classic one about pantheism, really. The individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, with the universe. Those who have known it, it is as real and overwhelming as falling in love. It's noetic during the experience. The integration could amplify that. Life review. There are also other experiences that don't fit into metaphysical systems like pantheism, but of metaphysical interest. So, for example, so Jaeger and Kim says, why are there just these qualia and not other possible ones? If you believe in qualia, controversial term, I realize that remains a mystery. By qualia here, it's meant just color or sound, right? So why is it that we see a certain light wave as a certain color? That seems random. We could see a light wave as, could perceive it as a sound. If we could navigate, that would be fine, and it wouldn't be wrong. Interestingly, on psychedelics, I've experienced at least, that's it, cat's out of the bag. The novel, that was nice. No, I've said it a million times before. I've had experiences that you can't categorize as colors, sounds, feelings, emotions, memories, completely alien, which is interesting metaphysically in terms of the possibilities of experience. I think Chris is talking about this more than me, so I'll skip it. Interestingly, this is our colleague, Luis Eduardo Luna, who writes, it's impossible to understand Amerindian animist culture without reference to psychedelic plants. So in the Amerindians, in the Americas rather, the indigenous people are generally animist. That coincides with panpsychism quite nicely, that nature is alive. Carlo Rovelli was inspired by LSD to look into the nature of time. Time, of course, is a big metaphysical issue, and an issue in physics, obviously. They're not always, metaphysical experiences are not necessarily pleasurable. For example, it's impossible to convey the horror of us being threatened with sheer nothingness, the fear of infinity. I wished I had the courage to find out where one is if one is nowhere. Benny Shannon, in this great seminal book, The Antipodes of the Mind, writes, overall, ayahuasca induces a comprehensive metaphysical view of things. I would characterize it as idealistic monism with pantheistic overtones. Reality is conceived as constituted by one non-material substance, which is identified as cosmic consciousness. Spinoza would accept them. Bicycle Day, a couple of days ago, wasn't it? 80 years. Albert Hoffman, in LSD, My Problem Child, in the last chapter, he writes, he starts the chapter with this epigraph, which reads, what more can a person gain in life than that God nature reveals himself to him? That's Goethe referencing Spinoza, who believed that nature was God, God was nature. That's fundamental pantheism. I believe that Spinoza's metaphysics can be used to understand certain psychedelic experiences. If you're interested, my book's on the forum there. Albert Hoffman also said this in the same book, the same chapter. A type of meta-medicine, meta-psychology, is beginning to call upon the metaphysical element in people and to make this element a basic healing principle and therapeutic practice. So that's what I'm suggesting today. I'm just expanding on Hoffman's idea. So let's look at the practicalities. Primary point is to remind you, psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences should be integrated with recourse to metaphysics. Not only that, it's an additional and optional tool. It's not a replacement of the great therapy that already takes place with the patient, participant. Of course, why? Because unlike most other forms of therapy, psychedelic therapy often involves metaphysical experience. Psychotherapists and so on are not trained in metaphysics. It's not in their professional ambit. I think there are some exceptions, existential psychotherapy, but generally speaking, it's not in their ambit. So the conjecture is this: offering a patient an additional and optional discussion of a schema of metaphysical perspectives, a metaphysics menu, with a manual perhaps and a course for integration may extend long-term benefits of psychedelic therapy, and beyond therapy might even could lead to societal enrichment. There can be no adequate integration of psychedelics without metaphysics. Controversial statement, I realize. And that's it. Thank you. And one more thing. I've just got one more slide very quickly. Formal announcement. It was in the Guardian this morning. We have now a new course about to start in January, Psychedelics, Mind, Medicine, Culture. It's a PG certificate, so a small master's course. It might lead to a greater master's as well. One of the first in the world. It's going to be philosophic, psychological, neuroscientific, and so on, ethical. It's going to be interdisciplinary. So if you're interested in that, email me. Thank you.